dear learners, welcome to another lecture in this MOOC of Population and Society. I am Ashirvad Chakravarti, guest lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Guwahati University. Now in the previous module, we saw the different indices that are used to measure the second variable of population dynamics or demographic studies, which is mortality. Now in this particular module, we shall move on to the third variable of measuring population change, migration. You must have already been made familiar with the concept of migration in one of the previous modules. The assumption before proceeding with this particular unit is that you have had a preliminary understanding of migration as a phenomenon and as a process, along with the various reasons and factors that make it happen. Let us now look at the objectives of this particular module. The first objective would be to revisit the concept of migration in brief, and then we'll understand in detail the direct measures of migration. After that, we'll introduce ourselves to the indirect measures of migration. And then, the next objective is to look at the primary sources of collecting data on movement of people. Finally, we'll have an empirical understanding of migration by looking at the figures across the globe. But to briefly summarize and revise on what has been discussed before, we can start off with defining what migration is. As you know, as the third determinant of population change, migration can be simply defined as movement of people from one place to another. Now interestingly, since nomadic movements are typically seasonal and lack the intention of settling in a new location, they are not classified as migratory movements. In addition, people who temporarily relocate for travel, tourism, pilgrimages, or are commuting for work are not considered to be migrants if they do not intend to live and settle in the locations that they visit. Now in the United Nations Multilingual Demographic Dictionary, migration is defined as a form of geographic mobility or spatial mobility between one geographical unit and another, generally involving a change in residence from the place of origin or place of departure to the place of destination or place of arrival. Now, unlike the previous two determinants, that is fertility and mortality, migration can be deemed as a purely social phenomenon. It does not only impact the size and growth of population of a certain region, but also alters the very nature and structure of a society. It is a response of human beings towards social and demographic forces. Now, these forces could be political, economic, or even forces of the physical environment, such as natural disasters. Floods, tsunamis, plagues, or even the recent anthropogenic event of the COVID-19 pandemic are very good examples of such natural factors. The demographers generally consider migration as one of the primary indicators of social change, which means it either leads to some sort of change or it is a product of a change itself. Now, why do we measure migration? Now, measuring migration is important for various reasons, as it provides valuable insights into the demographic, socio, economic, and political trends. Now, let us see the various reasons of measuring migration. The first reason is population dynamics. Now, migration significantly influences the size, distribution, and composition of population. Measuring migration helps demographers understand how population change over time. Next, we have an economic impact. Now, migration affects the supply and demand for labor in different regions. By measuring migration, policymakers and economists can analyze its impact on employment, wages, and overall economic productivity. Next, we have social integration. Now, migration contributes to cultural diversity as people bring their traditions, languages, and customs to new regions. Measuring migration also helps societies understand the dynamics of cultural integration and diversity. Next, we have the allocation of resources. The government and urban planners use migration data to anticipate and address the needs of growing or declining populations. This includes planning for housing, transportation, healthcare, and educational infrastructure. Next, we have the political implications. Now, migration can influence the demographics of voters, potentially shaping the political landscapes. understanding migration patterns is crucial for politicians and policymakers in developing effective strategies and policies. Migration is also closely linked to globalization. Measuring migration helps track the movement of people across borders, facilitating the understanding of global communication and trade patterns. Next we have the human rights and welfare. Monitoring migration is vital for assessing the scale of forced migration and displacement. It helps in formulating humanitarian policies and addressing the needs of refugees and asylum seekers. Next, migration patterns can impact the spread of diseases as well. Measuring migration is crucial for health authorities to monitor and respond to health challenges, especially in the context of pandemics and other health crises. Next we have the educational planning. Migration affects school enrollment patterns, and measuring migration is essential for educational planners to allocate resources, plan for linguistic diversity, and ensure equal access to education. Finally, migration often leads to urbanization affecting the environment and the ecological makeup. Measuring migration helps the policymakers understand the environmental stress associated with population movement and implement a sustainable development strategy. Now, as you are aware, there are different categorizations of migration. First category is known as the internal migration, which is the movement of people within a country. Next, we have the international migration, which is the movement between countries. Then we have in-migration, which can be defined as movement of people into a region, which is also known as immigration when we speak in terms of international movement. Then we have out-migration, which is the movement of people outside of a region. Then we have temporal migration as well, which is based on a certain time period. It can then be further divided into daily, periodic, seasonal, or permanent movement of people. Finally, we have causal migration. Now, depending upon the cause of migration, the process can be forced or voluntary. In terms of forced migration, we can see the different causes related to political or economic factors. In terms of voluntary migration, brain drain is a very good example of it. Now, according to the International Organization for Migration, any person who moves or has moved across an international border or within a state that is different from their habitual place of residence is considered a migrant. Now, effective policies, programs, and operational responses on the ground can result from examining the changes in migration scale, direction, demographics, and frequency. Let us now look at the measures or the indices of migration that forms the essence of this very lecture. Now, these indices can be broadly categorized as the direct and indirect measures of migration. The direct measures are based on data collected by a set of direct questions during a census survey. On the other hand, special questions are not needed for indirect measures of estimating migration. The total counts in a census and the available age-sex distribution of the population can be used to estimate the extent of movement of people or migration. Now first, we shall look at the direct measures of migration, specifically the internal migration. These direct measures are based on certain questions pertaining to movement which are directly elicited from the migrants themselves. They are data based on the first-hand experiences of the people who have moved from one region to another. Now, these questions can be categorized into 4 different forms. The first form of question is based on the place of birth. The place of birth is a question that is asked in almost all census surveys. Based on the data gathered from this inquiry, every individual in the population can be categorized into 2 groups. The first group are known as the lifetime migrants. The lifetime migrants are the people who have been enumerated or marked in a place which is different from their place of birth. For example, a person born in Guwahati but grew up in Delhi, where he or she would be registered during a census survey, would be deemed as a lifetime migrant. Then we have the next category of people who are the non-migrants. Now, the non-migrants are the people who have been enumerated in the place of their birth. These are the people who are recorded during census as having the address of residence same as the place where they were born. Now there are a number of benefits and drawbacks to measuring lifetime internal migration using just birthplace information. The place of birth question is straightforward, easy to understand, and suggests that the respondents will be able to remember it. As a result, the response is quite accurate and comprehensive. But due to the various social practices, an artificial bias can be introduced in the information gathered about the place of birth. For example, in most parts in India, women expecting childbirth usually go to their native place or to their parents' house. Now this often leads to childbirth, which makes the baby a lifetime migrant. Therefore, it has been suggested that rather than the actual place of birth, the parent's usual place of residence should be used to determine the place of birth for such a child. Next question is based on the duration of residence. Occasionally, the census questionnaire includes a question about how long a person has lived at the location of enumeration or the location where he or she has been marked during the census. An examination of the data gathered from this particular inquiry creates a different method of studying migration. The people who have spent their entire lives in the counting region are considered to be as non-migrants. Now, based on how long they have lived at the place where the data was recorded, two groups are classified as migrants. The first group are the group of people who are born outside the area of counting or enumeration, and the second group of people are those who are born in the area of enumeration but who lived outside of it at some point of time. These are also known as return migrants. The interesting distinction or difference between the measure based on the place of birth and duration of residence is that the questions on place of birth do not consider the factor of return migrants. However, there are issues with the data's accuracy regarding the duration of residency as well. The individual providing the information, typically the head of the household, might not be fully aware of how long each member of the household has lived there. The next question is based on the place of last residence. Now, to obtain information on the last movement of a person from one region to another, the questions based on the place of last residence are asked. This is similar to the question on place of birth. In the study of migration, residency data is advantageous because it shows a direct movement from the place of origin to the place of destination. This then facilitates or helps calculating the amount of in-migration, out-migration, and net migration between two places. The information collected can then be used to classify migrants into two types. The first type are the migrants whose current residence is different from their previous residence, and then we have the non-migrants who have never left their hometown. The fourth question is the question based on the place of residence at a fixed prior date. When the concept of the place of last residence is used to estimate migration, all the migrants, irrespective of their interval of movement, are clubbed into the same pool of data. Therefore, in some countries, the census or sample survey questionnaires contain a question regarding residency on a given particular date or time period. The answers to those questions are helpful for any study on migration because they show that there is a clear migration interval. Determining one's status of migration involves comparing one's place of residence at two distinct times, and that a person is considered a migrant if their address on the census date differs from their address on a specified date. Now, when analyzing current migration and calculating the period migration rate, such data are extremely helpful. This can be exemplified in the discourse of NRC in India, where a prior set date or time period is the primary factor in determining migrants and forming the whole debate around citizenship. Any migration measurement that is based on a person's residence at a particular past date is simple and compact. Because of this, many demographers believed it to be a more useful and satisfactory measure for migration analysis than those based on last residence or just place of birth data. Now, let us look at the different limitations of this particular approach. So, one of its limitations lies in recall lapse, that is, failure to remember the time period and the place that are to be mentioned. People find it usually very difficult to remember where they were living at an arbitrary date. and this may subsequently lead to wrongful categorization. The second limitation is that this process also does not take into account those migrants who moved during the migration interval and moved back to the place where they were residing at a fixed prior date. The migration interval is the period from the prior fixed date to the date of the census. For example, if I was residing at New Delhi on a fixed prior date, but have been moving around due to work during the migration interval, that is the time period between the particular date to the date of recording, the data becomes skewed when this question is focused upon. And finally, the last limitation is that in this particular question, the movement of children who were born during the migration interval outside the place of counting are also not taken into account. Now let us look at the indirect measures of migration. Apart from the method of measuring migration, which involves asking direct questions about migratory movements in census surveys, one can also estimate migration by utilizing the population counts from two consecutive census operations. Based on the demographic balancing equation, which explains how migration, birth and death affect a population size and its nature in a particular region, indirect methods generally calculate the net migration. Now you must be wondering, what is net migration? The net migration is the difference of the number of people moving out of a region and the number of people coming in over a certain population within a period of time. Mathematically, as you can see on your screen, it is Mi minus Mo, where Mi is the number of in-migration in an area and Mo is the number of out-migration in an area over the population of that particular area in the middle of the year. Now, a positive value of net migration shows that more people are entering the region than leaving it, while a negative value means more people are leaving the region than entering it. Now, during a case of excessive brain drain, we can see a negative value of net migration, whereas when it comes to unchecked or unsolicited movement of people across boundaries, the net migration gains its positive value. Now, even without any migration data, it is possible to calculate the expected population count at the end of the interval. Now, it is possible only if the population counts of an area at two different points in time are known, along with the number of birth and the number of death. The estimate of the net change brought about by migration is obtained from the difference between the observed and the expected population. And these estimations can be produced by applying two different strategies. They are using either the vital statistics method or using the survival probability estimates. Now let us look at the vital statistics method. The estimate of a natural increase between two consecutive census operations can be obtained in a nation or a location where reliable information on birth and death in its population is available. Now, one can calculate the estimates of net migration by deducting the total population change from its natural increase. It is important to keep in mind that the estimates of net migration derived from the vital statistics method incorporate the data on international migration. A simple formula for determining net migration is an example of a balancing equation which I mentioned previously. The equation, as you can see on the screen, is Px minus Py minus B minus D, where Px is the population increase or population in the recent census, or Py is the population in the previous census, and B is the number of births in that area during the intercensual period, that is between two census, and D is the number of deaths in that area during the same period. However, the birth and death statistics collected by vital registration systems in developing nations are of low quality because they lack sufficient and accurate information. Therefore, the estimation of net migration based on this particular approach is impacted by errors in the reporting of birth and deaths. Next we have the survival ratio method. Now, based on the survivorship probabilities derived from the current life tables, this method estimates the net internal migration for the time interval between two census operations. The most important data are the age distribution by sex as recorded in each area in two consecutive census operations, as well as a set of survivorship ratios that can be used to calculate the number of individuals expected to survive to the second census based on the population count from the first census. Now, the estimate of net internal migration is the difference between the population at the end of the second census and the population that was expected. And if there are no suitable life tables available, or if using the ones that are available is prohibited for any reason, it is possible to estimate net migration by calculating the survival ratios of 2 consecutive census operations. However, estimates of net migration for individuals born during the intercensual period cannot be obtained using either the life table survival ratio method or the census survival ratio method. It might be necessary to use alternative suitable methods for this particular purpose. It should also be noted that the migration estimates produced by the census survival ratio method have built-in corrections for the age errors that are inherent in census data. It therefore makes them superior to those produced by computing life table survivorship probabilities. Next, let us look at the migration rate. A number of people who may have migrated during a specific migration interval that are related to the population is known as the migration rate. It can be mathematically represented as m by p into k, where m is the number of persons migrating during the interval, p is the population exposed to the likelihood of migration during that particular period, or the mid-year population, and k is a constant which usually depends on per 1000 people or per 100 people. Now, migration rate for in-migration, the formula remains same, but the numerator here is the number of in-migrants in a given population. Similarly, the migration rate for out-migration is a similar formula, but here the numerator is the number of out-migrants in a given population. Next, we have the gross migration. The gross migration is calculated as the ratio of the sum of in-migration and out-migration with the total exposed population, which is then of course multiplied by a constant. Now, mathematically, as you can see on the screen, it can be expressed as the ratio of the summation of the number of in-migrants and out-migrants to the estimated mid-year population. Now, it is imperative to understand the data that is being collected when it comes to movement of people between two regions. Where can we track this source of data? What are the different reservoirs where these data are stored? Let us have a look. The first source of data is of course the census data that we are all familiar with. The national censuses are fundamental source of migration data. Governments conduct censuses at regular intervals, providing a comprehensive overview of the population change, including information on place of birth, residence, and nationality. The census data offers a snapshot of the demographic composition of a country and helps identify the trends in migration patterns. Next, we have the administrative records. The government agencies, they maintain administrative records related to migration, such as immigration and immigration records, visas, and residency permits. Now, these records are invaluable for tracking the flow of people across borders and can offer detailed insights into the characteristics of migrants, such as age, gender, religion, and occupation. Next, we have the surveys and sample studies. Now, social surveys and sample studies conducted by various statistical agencies, research institutions, and international organizations provide an in-depth information on movement of people. These surveys often collect data on reasons for migration, integration experiences, and socio-economic impacts, offering a more nuanced understanding of migration dynamics. Next, we have the border control and travel records. The information collected at border control points, such as airports and border crossings, contribute to migration data as well. Passport stamps, entry and exit records, and travel itineraries help authorities track the movement of individuals across national borders, aiding in the measurement of international migration. This particular source is also convenient in understanding movement of people within a country as well. Next, we have the population registers. Some countries maintain population registers that record vital information about residents, including change in residence. These registers are valuable for tracking internal migration, offering insights into urbanization trends and regional population dynamics. Now, if we look into various empirical data that are being produced by measuring various migration rates using different measures, we may see that According to the United Nations Populations Division, in the year 2021, Venezuela had the highest number of people moving out of the region, followed by Pakistan, India, and China. All of them had a negative net migration of highest values. As you can see on your screen, Venezuela stood at -525,116. On the other hand, the United States of America had the highest positive net migration in the year 2021. As you can see on your screen, it was followed by Russia, Germany, Nepal, and Spain. Now this means that due to various socio-economic and political factors, more number of people have moved into these countries compared to other countries. Now when it comes to internal migration, according to the Indian census of 2011, the number of internal migrants both within and between the states was 45.36 crores. This figure made up 37% of the total population. Additionally, the annual net migrant flow was found to be around 1% of the total working population. According to a report published by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, the top 25% of male out-migration from India centered around 17 districts. Of these 17 districts, 6 were in Bihar, 1 in Odisha, and 10 were in Uttar Pradesh. An economic survey done in 2016-17 reports that states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which are comparatively less developed, have high net out-migration. Net immigration is reflected in the relatively more developed states of Goa, Delhi, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka. The Delhi region accounted for over half of migration in 2015 and 16, making it the largest recipient of people. However, when combined, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh account for half of all the out-migrants. Now, a report on migration in India, surveyed in 2021, presents us with an interesting set of empirical data. The Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation compiled this data on migrants and temporary visitors and released the report in June 2022. So between July 2020 and June 2021, 0.7% of the nation's population was identified as a temporary visitor. Those who moved into households after March 2020 and remained continuously for at least 15 days but less than 6 months were classified as temporary visitors. The COVID-19 pandemic caused more than 84% of these 0.7% of temporary visitors to relocate, as we have seen from the mass exodus of workers from various states to their place of origin during the lockdown. Between July 2020 and June 2021, the migration rate throughout all of India was at 28.9%. It was 26.5% in rural areas and 34.9% in the urban areas. Now, the percentage of female migration was higher at 47.9%, with 48% of them occurring in rural areas and 47.8% in urban areas. Male migration was at 10.7%, with 5.9% of them living in the rural areas, whereas the 22.5% in the urban areas. Whereas 49.6% of men moved in quest of work, 86.8% of women moved after they got married. Now, in conclusion, measuring migration is essential for informed decision making across various sectors, enabling governments, organizations, and communities to adapt to demographic changes and address the challenges and opportunities that migration brings. In the next unit, you shall learn about the indirect measures of measuring the various indices of population change. Thank you.